Have you ever noticed how some things seem to change around you when you begin to awaken spiritually? As if the whole world reacts differently to your presence, to your energy, to your new way of seeing reality? There is something profoundly mysterious happening when a person embarks on their journey of spiritual awakening, something that Alan Watts understood with rare clarity and that few dare to openly acknowledge. There exists a silent knowledge, an ancient wisdom that has been whispering to us since time immemorial, saying that certain secrets should not be revealed hastily, not out of selfishness or arrogance, but because the world around us is not always prepared to understand or accept the transformations occurring in our consciousness. When you begin to awaken spiritually, when your perceptions expand and you start to see beyond the everyday illusions that keep most people trapped in automatic patterns of thought and behavior, something fundamental shifts in your essence. And it is precisely at this delicate moment, in this transitional phase between the sleep of ordinary consciousness and the awakening to deeper realities, that you need to learn the art of sacred silence, the wisdom of keeping certain secrets to yourself, not because you wish to feel superior or different from others, but because there are truths that can only be understood by those who have reached the same point on the journey. Alan Watts, that extraordinary philosopher who served as a bridge between Eastern wisdom and Western thought, understood perfectly that spiritual awakening is not a public event. It is not something that needs to be announced to the four winds as if it were an achievement to be displayed in the showcases of human vanity. On the contrary, he knew that the deepest transformations occur in silence, in inner stillness, away from the curious and often skeptical gazes of those who have not yet begun their own journey of self-discovery and consciousness expansion. The first secret you should never reveal when you are awakening spiritually relates to your new perceptions about the illusory nature of everyday reality. When you begin to realize that much of what people consider absolutely real and important is, in fact, a collective mental construct, a tacit agreement on how to interpret the human experience, you find yourself facing a profound existential dilemma. The concerns that once consumed your attention, the anxieties that seem so devastating, the fears that dominated your sleepless nights, all of this begins to lose its density, its solidity, its ability to control your inner peace. You discover that there is a dimension of human experience that completely transcends the everyday drama, a broader perspective from which the problems that torment most people reveal themselves as storms in teacups, as shadows on the wall that only frighten because we do not recognize their true ephemeral and insubstantial nature. But here is the crucial point that Alan Watts would alert us to understand. When you try to share this perception with people who are still completely identified with the drama of their lives, when you try to explain that what consumes them with worry is fundamentally less solid than it seems, you are not offering liberation. You are, in fact, invalidating their experience, diminishing something that is still deeply real and important to them. And the result of this is not collective spiritual awakening, not shared enlightenment, but rather distancing misunderstanding. The feeling that you have become arrogant, insensitive, or disconnected from the shared reality. People who have not yet awakened spiritually need their worries, they need their dramas, because it is through these challenges that they will eventually be propelled toward their own awakening. Trying to prematurely yank them out of this process is like trying to force a flower to bloom before it is ready to open naturally under the warmth of the sun and the gentleness of time. The second secret that you must carefully guard relates to your experiences of deep connection with something greater than the individual ego. When you are awakening spiritually, moments of dissolution of the boundaries between you and the rest of existence begin to occur. Instances in which the usual separation between observer and observed simply disappears, revealing an underlying unity that has always been present, but that your conditioned mind could not perceive. These experiences are profoundly transformative, sacred in their essence, and carry with them a power that words can never fully capture. Alan Watts used to say that trying to describe these mystical experiences to someone who has never had them is like trying to explain the color red to a person who is blind from birth, or describing the taste of honey to someone who has never tasted anything sweet. Words fail not due to a limitation of vocabulary, but because the very nature of the experience transcends the conceptual domain, inhabits a territory that is beyond language, beyond discursive thought, beyond any mental map we can construct. And when you try to share these experiences with people who are still entirely identified with their separate ego, With their personal narrative of I versus the world, what happens at best is gentle misunderstanding, and at worst, ridicule, aggressive skepticism, or concern that you are losing touch with consensual reality. More importantly, in trying to verbalize these ineffable experiences, you often diminish them, distort them, turn them into something much smaller than they truly were, imprisoning the infinite in finite words, reducing the unfathomable mystery to mere spiritual anecdotes that can be consumed and forgotten like any other mental entertainment. If you are following along and feeling that these words resonate with something deep in your own journey of spiritual awakening, consider subscribing to the channel to continue exploring these fascinating territories of human consciousness. Leave a comment sharing which city you are watching from, and don't forget to leave your like, as this immensely helps to bring this content to other people who are also seeking to understand the mysteries of spiritual awakening in their lives. The third secret you should never reveal when you are awakening spiritually directly relates to your growing ability to perceive the unconscious patterns of behavior in the people around you. As your consciousness expands and you become more present, more attentive, more awake to the subtle mechanisms that govern human behavior, you inevitably begin to notice things that previously went completely unnoticed. You see how people are trapped in repetitive cycles of thought, how they reenact the same emotional dramas time and again, how their fears and insecurities lead them to act in predictable and self-sabotaging ways, how most conversations are merely parallel monologues where no one truly listens to the other but only waits for their turn to speak again. You perceive the social masks that everyone wears, the roles they play without even knowing they are acting, the stories they tell themselves about who they are and why they do what they do, stories that rarely correspond to the deeper reality of their unconscious motivations. Alan Watts would remind us that this growing perception is not a superpower to be flaunted or a weapon to be used against others, but rather a responsibility that comes with its own burden of compassion and humility. Because along with the ability to see the unconscious patterns of others comes the inevitable recognition that you yourself have lived trapped in exactly those same patterns, that there is nothing special or superior about having awakened to these mechanisms, just the mysterious grace of timing, what we call soul maturity or readiness to see what has always been there. But when you reveal to people that you can see through their masks, when you point out the unconscious patterns that govern them, when you try to show them that much of their suffering is self-imposed and based on illusions they themselves keep alive through their beliefs and mental narratives, you are not offering liberation. You are threatening the fundamental structures through which they organize and understand their lives. Most people are not ready to see their own shadows, are not prepared to confront the defense mechanisms they have carefully built over the years to protect their fragile sense of identity and psychological security. The result of revealing this kind of perception prematurely is almost always some form of resistance or hostility, because you have touched on something that the person is not ready to acknowledge in themselves. They may react with denial, saying that you are making things up or projecting your own problems onto them, or they may simply withdraw, feeling uncomfortable with your presence that now seems invasive or judgmental, even if your intention was genuinely to help or share a perception you considered valuable. Alan Watts often spoke about the importance of respecting each person's path, of understanding that every human being is exactly where they need to be in their evolutionary journey, and that trying to rush the awakening process, the spiritual awakening of another person, is as futile as trying to make the sun rise earlier simply because you are already awake and eager for the day to begin. There is a natural rhythm, an organic timing for all transformations of consciousness, and this timing cannot be forced or accelerated by external pressure, no matter how well-intentioned it may be. People awaken when they are ready, when the pain of unconsciousness becomes greater than the fear of facing the truth, when life places them in situations that force them to question their fundamental assumptions about reality and themselves. And until that moment arrives, all your explanations, all your shared insights, all your attempts to illuminate their path will be, at best, seeds planted that may someday germinate, and at worst, unwanted intrusions into psychological territories that are not yet open for external visitation. The fourth and final secret that you must quietly hold in your heart when you are spiritually awakening is perhaps the most paradoxical and the most difficult of all. Do not reveal that you are spiritually awakening. It seems contradictory, doesn't it? After all, if you are undergoing such profound transformations, If your worldview is expanding in ways that fundamentally alter how you experience reality, wouldn't it be natural to want to share this with the people you love, with your friends, with your family, with everyone who could potentially benefit from knowing that there is a path beyond the ordinary suffering of unawakened consciousness? But here's the wisdom that Alan Watts would convey to us. True spiritual awakening does not need to be announced because it manifests naturally through your presence, through your actions, through the quality of peace and centeredness that emanates from you without any conscious effort. When you are genuinely spiritually awakening, when you are becoming more aware, more present, more connected with the deep dimension of your own essential nature, this is reflected in how you live, in how you respond to life's challenges, in how you treat other people, in how you navigate the inevitable difficulties and uncertainties of human existence. You do not need to wear a badge saying, "I am spiritually awakening," because your own way of being becomes the living testimony of this inner transformation. But when you verbally announce that you are spiritually awakening, when you publicly identify as someone who is on a spiritual path, when you make a point of having others know about your practices, your experiences, your achievements in the realm of consciousness, you inadvertently create a new spiritual ego, a new layer of identity that is potentially even more subtle and dangerous than the ordinary ego you were trying to transcend. Because now you're not just João or Maria, you are João who is spiritually awakening, or Maria who practices meditation and is on a path of elevated consciousness. And this new spiritual identity can become another source of separation, another reason to feel different or special, another obstacle between you and the natural simplicity of simply being, without labels, without stories, without the need to prove or demonstrate anything to anyone. Alan Watts had a brilliant way of unmasking the spiritual ego, this subtle yet powerful tendency to turn the very path of spiritual awakening into yet another ego project, another area where to seek fulfillment, recognition, and external validation. He warned us that the most sophisticated trap on the spiritual path is precisely the one in which we believe we have escaped all traps. The moment we think we have achieved something special that places us above or beyond those who still live in common unconsciousness. Because at that very moment, when you feel proud of your spiritual awakening, when you look at others with a mix of condescending compassion and secret satisfaction for having seen beyond what they can still perceive, you are not awakening. You are dreaming a different dream, perhaps more subtle, perhaps more spiritually adorned, but still a dream of separation, still an illusion that there is an I that is evolving, progressing, improving along some linear path toward enlightenment. The deepest truth that Alan Watts repeatedly pointed out is that spiritual awakening is not a process of accumulation. It is not a journey in which you add knowledge, experiences, or spiritual achievements to your inner curriculum, but rather a process of subtraction, of letting go, of abandoning all identifications, all stories, all beliefs about who you are and what you need to become. It is an increasingly deep recognition that what you fundamentally are never needed to awaken because it was never asleep. It is the very witnessing consciousness that observes both sleep states and waking states without being affected by either. And this consciousness does not take pride in itself, does not compare itself with other consciousnesses, does not feel the need to announce its presence or prove its existence. It simply is, pure and silently, the empty and vibrant space within which all experience occurs. When you keep these four secrets quietly held, when you resist the temptation to reveal your new perceptions about the illusory nature of common reality, when you honor the sacredness of your mystical experiences by not trying to translate them into inadequate words for public consumption, when you respect each person's path by seeing their unconscious patterns but not pointing them out invasively, and when you avoid creating a new identity based on being spiritually awakening, something wonderful happens. You discover that silence is not the absence of communication, but the deepest form of communication that exists. You begin to convey not through words and explanations, but through presence, through the quality of attention you bring to each interaction, through the peace that remains unshaken even amid the surrounding chaos, through the genuine compassion that arises naturally when you see the struggles of others not as weaknesses to be corrected, but as part of the sacred process through which each individual consciousness eventually returns to the recognition of its essential nature. You become like a silent spring in the desert, not shouting for people to come drink, but simply being present, available, refreshing for those who arrive naturally, guided by their own inner thirst, ready to receive without you needing to persuade, convince, or convert anyone. Alan Watts would remind us that the deepest transformations happen not through preaching or spiritual proselytism, but through the silent contagion of awakened presence, the way a centered and peaceful person can elevate the vibration of an entire environment without saying a single word about spirituality, meditation, or awakening. There is a deep humility in this silent path, an understanding that you do not really know what is best for others, that your own journey of spiritual awakening is unique and does not necessarily serve as a universal model for how everyone should awaken. You recognize that life has its own wisdom, its own perfect timing for each person, and that your function is not to accelerate or direct anyone's awakening, but simply to remain true to your own truth, to live authentically from the depth you have discovered, and to trust that this alone is sufficient contribution to the collective awakening of human consciousness. Because every person who spiritually awakens, even if silently, without fanfare or public announcement, adds their particular light to the collective field of consciousness, making it a little easier for the next person to awaken, creating cracks in the matrix of consensual reality through which light can enter. And perhaps that is all any of us can or should do. Awaken silently, live authentically, love unconditionally, and trust that the rest will unfold naturally as it should. If these reflections on spiritual awakening and the teachings of Alan Watts have touched something deep within you, consider subscribing to the channel to continue exploring together these fascinating mysteries of human consciousness. Share in the comments from which city you are watching us, as it is always inspiring to see how these ideas resonate with people from so many different places. And leave your like to help more people find this content on their own spiritual awakening journeys. Until our next meeting, may you walk your path with silent wisdom and an open heart.